Hi, good morning, everybody. Welcome. We're going to talk about the state of the special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States with two extraordinary people. Peter Mandelson is one of the most gifted political minds I've ever encountered, played a historic role in changing the Labour Party and making it a governing party in Britain. Unfortunately, it's changing back a bit. Anne Applebaum is a commentator and really a scholar whose range and breadth are astounding, from American politics to British politics, from Eastern Europe to the editorial board of the Washington Post. She also, by the way, chronicled the rise of New Labour in Britain in 1996 and 1997. Before I get to the present moment of Trump and Brexit, let me step back and ask both of you, over time, how special has the special relationship actually been? Anne, do you want to start?
It's always been a tricky phrase, the special relationship, because it's something that's used a lot in Britain, and it's discussed and debated, and it's in headlines, and people bring it up in speeches and have seminars to worry about it. And I've never had the impression that it has the same force or significance in the United States. And you don't have special seminars on the special relationship, and it's not part of the debate and the discussion in the same way. People speak about America and Europe, they speak about transatlantic relationships. There have been moments, I think, when it's always been clear that there's a deep, I think, because of the English language and because in a way the US and the UK share a political conversation. So it's not just that we have different systems, but we're all speaking English, we're reading each other's press. People like Bob Shrum go back and forth across the Atlantic, and people like Peter Mandelson. There's a way in which our politics have often mirrored one another. So there's the famous Reagan-Thatcher relationship. There's the famous Clinton-Blair relationship. And indeed Bush-Blair relationship, and now we have a rather dysfunctional May-Trump relationship. But so it's it's special, but in an imbalanced way. I would say it's more special to the British than it is to the Americans, and in that sense, and as Europe has become less important under this presidency, sort of remarkably, I think the special relationship suffers too.
Peter, more special to Britain and to the United States?
I think special to both in the sense that Britain has had a particular relevance to the United States because of the habitual, sort of comfortable, easy, common, garden conversation that exists between Brits and Americans at so many different levels. I'm not just talking about the level of high state, but right across the board. And certainly, if you can think of the American system, I mean, the governance and that of Britain, I mean, I've seen very closely, having been a member of the cabinet, how interlocked, how closely the systems work together. And that is because, we do share a similar outlook. We share very strong common values and commitment to democracy, to freedom of speech, to the rule of law. These things are easy just to sort of spill off the tongue, but they actually do mean something in day-to-day policy making and statecraft. We also have shared interests, not the same as our values, but we also have a history of having constructed more, I would say, than any other nation in the world. The two of us, more than any other, created the post-war international order, the Bretton Woods system, and the institutions that remain just about, on a good day, the pillars of that order. And so the legacy that we have, I think, is strong. The continued sharing of values and outlook exists. Our relevance to the United States, of course, has been that we've been prepared to fight. I mean, we do believe that where appropriate and where necessary, the rule of international law does have to be backed by force, and we've been prepared on more than one occasion to fight with and alongside the Americans. But of course, it's also the case that when we chose to fight alongside the US in Iraq, that had a very negative impact on public opinion in Britain and our attitudes towards the United States, government and policy at the time. But I don't think it sort of destroyed that affinity between the two countries and our peoples, which endures.
So assuming that it endures over time and that there are these very large factors that underpin it, there are also some disruptive things going on now.
In both our countries.
Yes, and that's exactly what I was about to allude to. How have the coming of Trump and the coming of Brexit affected the special relationship, and how will they? You want to start, Peter?
Well, our politics in both our countries are currently being disrupted very badly. Britain, like the United States, is being forced to sort of step back and reconsider its alliances, how it conducts its foreign policy. The advent of Trumpian American unilateralism obviously fights very directly with Britain and Europe's commitment to the multilateral system and multilateral institutions in the world. We are frankly finding it incredibly difficult to come to terms with what President Trump means by putting America first, and the obvious disdain that he has for many of his allies. The way in which he speaks about NATO has been shocking to us in Europe. The fact that he's prepared to ride a coach and horses through the rules-based international trading system and actually, in effect, sabotage the day-to-day working of the WTO and even talk about leaving it. I mean, if they have any meaning and if they have any force, these positions of his will have a cataclysmic impact on how we manage the world and how we sort out our differences and arrive at common views. Now, for the West, basically for the international system as a whole, in my view, the bedrock, the anchor of that international order has been the transatlantic alliance. And I think the two nations, I'm not being exclusivist about this, but I do think that in Europe, the country that's been most committed or has interpreted most actively what it means to have that alliance with the United States has been Britain. And we have to sort of just step back and wonder whether those assumptions on which we've operated for so many decades in the post-war era are going to be valid anymore in the United States. I happen to think they will be post-Trump, but don't be surprised if many people are wondering whether we can make those assumptions anymore about the functioning of the West, about the transatlantic alliance, and that sort of bedrock or anchor for it, which is the relationship between Britain and the United States. And in the meantime, we have Brexit, which is essentially going to lead Britain into a prolonged period of introspection, where we are going to lose the influence that we have had in the world, because our membership of the European Union has been a very significant multiplier of our influence and the deployment of our soft power. Our economy is going to grow less well over the next sort of 20 years at least. We are going to have very severe constraints on economic growth, on treasury revenues and public spending. We are going to be able to spend less on our military capability in the future than we have in the past, and that is going to make us less relevant to our alliance and to the United States. It's to me, it's an extraordinarily sad development in affairs.
Before I get to my follow-up, let me ask you and before I get to Anne, and she can weigh in on this too. President Trump is scheduled to have a state visit in London this year, where he, I think, wants to parade through the street in the coach. How do you think this will go?
How bad can it get? Look, I think it's right in principle that the President of the United States should be able to pay a state visit to Britain. I'd prefer to see it at the sort of back end of his time in office rather than this early. I think that if he behaves on this occasion as he did when he paid his official non-state visit, I think it will create embarrassment to the government and potentially even to the Queen, because he will be the guest of our head of state, Her Majesty the Queen. I mean, he went out of his way when he was in London previously to act in a very patronizing and demeaning way towards our Prime Minister. He clearly ain't keen on, women heads of government, whether it be in Britain or Germany.
Or the U.S.
Or even with his friend Nancy. So I fear for it, and I think that it could be extremely damaging to relations, even though in principle I believe it should happen. Sorry for the equivocation, but Mr. Trump.
That's all right. You were in politics.
Yeah, I was in politics, and occasionally still am. But Mr. Trump does that to people. He makes people a bit.
So, and what about the confluence of these events? Trump, Brexit, state visit, all of this put together.
So I started out by talking about how sometimes it feels, I am actually an American, I live in Britain, I have a British passport, so I have some kind of dual perspective. And to repeat what I said initially, there is some kind of transatlantic English language Anglo-Saxon conversation that goes on all the time. And I think, of course, it's not a coincidence that the rise of Trump and Brexit happened at the same time. Brexit was in many ways the product of a kind of particularly English nationalism and a sense of kind of hurt feelings of superiority. We should have more say in the world. We should have more influence. We're being put upon by foreigners. It reflected a kind of fear of globalization. Even the slogans that were used in the Brexit campaign were all about, helping people cure their sense that they don't control current events anymore. So "Take Back Control" was this actually very brilliant slogan, which can mean, of course, a lot of things to anybody. And some people interpreted that as "Take back control, there'll be no more immigrants in the country," and by which they meant not just European immigrants, but all immigrants. Take back control, we can decide where our cars are produced and not some Chinese people or some Germans. Take back control, we can make decisions about culture and so on and so on. And a lot of it was illusory. But it was some of the same, we know from our recent election and from our politics over the last 2 years that some of that same impulse has been at work here. People wanting, whether it's using the slogan "America First" or whether it's using "Make America Great Again," there's a parallel kind of nostalgia for a time when we were great, or we imagined that we were great and things were better. And you see this nostalgia on both sides of the Atlantic with similar effects. There's another way, though, in which the two politics are similar, in that there's a weird echo effect between the American Republican Party and the British Tory Party, I think. And these are both political parties that had very important, powerful ideological moments in the 1980s and 1990s when there were very important intellectuals involved in both of them. They were, believers in democracy and free markets. They both experienced this triumph of the fall of communism, this sense of, we are right, we were correct in this, we won this argument. And they both right now, and I say this as somebody who's worked for both conservative magazines, on both sides of the Atlantic as well, in conservative publications, they both now have a feeling of being post-ideological parties that want to bring back some kind of better era. And they both feel to me a little bit lost. You know, are we still really in favor of democracy? What does that mean? The financial crisis actually shook the leadership in both senses. You know, this certainty that our system is correct and ours is the best. You can feel that lacking in both parties. You know, and it's almost like there's a post-ideological moment. I mean, there's a reason why you know, money and corruption have been such big issues on both sides of the Atlantic. There's a reason why, you know, there's a reason why, you know, both seem to sometimes feel that they're floundering. I mean, the one of the, you know, I hope we're actually not going to discuss too much about the mechanics of Brexit, because it's an almost unbearably complicated conversation now. But one of the things that's happening is that Theresa May keeps making choices that are good for her party, which is very divided and very split, but aren't necessarily good for the country. So she keeps choosing to maximize party unity and prevent the Tory party from breaking up, sometimes at the expense of solutions or unifying solutions that could be good for the, you know, she's not looking for example, for a cross majority across the House of Commons that could solve Brexit in some ways, whether incorporating the Labour Party, because that would then split off some of the Tories. So you have similar kinds of splits and similar kind of disorientation, I think, in the two leading parties on both sides of the Atlantic.
You just seem to have suggested that Prime Minister May is Trump without Twitter, that that she's
little
catering
unfair.
to.
That's a little harsh.
That's a little harsh.
I think.
Well, that, you know,
I mean, I'm not a
just as he's
Tory,
trying
but-
to satisfy the Freedom
Yeah.
Caucus, she's trying to satisfy the European Research Group, the people who are the strongest Brexiteers.
Yeah, so
But
you don't have the feeling that she believes in them. You know, it's not, you know, it's her group because, I mean, she has to incorporate them somehow, but one is never really sure, you know, what she actually believes.
She's not an extreme leader.
No, she's not.
She's a weak leader, but she's not an extreme one.
Her mostly what she's been trying to do for 2 years is keep her party together. And that's proved actually much more difficult than actually negotiating with the European Union.
So let me talk about a leader and bring this back to the special relationship, who in fact may be weaker than he appears or thinks he is. President Trump has explicitly rooted for Brexit. Long term, does that weaken or strengthen the special relationship?
Well,
Depends what happens. But
Well, assuming it moves ahead.
look, you know, to us in Britain, he appears a bit like Putin, quite honestly. The two of them want to weaken the European Union. The two of them don't believe in countries working together. The two of them are rooting for Brexit. I mean, this is weird, isn't it? Well, perhaps it's not. Perhaps it's not. Perhaps they are two nationalist, populist leaders, you know, who on a good day imagine that they might be good global citizens, but it have in fact turned out to be disruptors, wreckers of the international system. And, you know, you can understand why both Putin and Trump are playing exclusively to a domestic audience, not to the whole of their country's domestic audience, but to one part of it. And for Putin, the only way in which he can sustain himself in office is not obviously by transforming, you know, the economy and the prospects and social opportunities of people in Russia. That he's not doing. What he can do, though, is to continue to stoke unity by creating enemies and targets, by appealing to people's sort of uber-Russian nationalism. It's a sort of survival strategy for Putin. Well, I don't think that what Trump is doing is entirely dissimilar, quite honestly. He's sustaining himself in power, sustaining that popularity that he has amongst that sort of wedge of the American public, not by transforming, you know, their economic prospects or transforming sort of social mobility in the United States, but by putting America first, by making people proud to be American, by talking the whole time about American exceptionalism. Now, this amounts to the same thing as what, in my view, Mr. Putin is doing in Russia. So they're almost bound to welcome Brexit. That they're anti-multilateralists, they're anti-internationalists. Their whole political shtick, is to create blame and fear and to foment divisions in order to benefit from those politically. That's what populists do.
A lot depends on what Trump turns out to be in the longer term. So Europeans often ask me, when he's gone, because he does create a huge anxiety in Europe because his dislike of NATO is known, his affinity for Russia is known. He has been rude to most European allies at one time or another, and people want to know, will it all go back to normal afterwards? In other words, after 2 years or 6 years, will we have an American president who values the alliance again? And the thing that I can't answer, and I genuinely don't know the answer to this, is, clearly he does represent a part of the country. So his dislike of NATO and his dislike of alliances was known before he was elected. He's been talking about it for years. It was in his, when it was in his books. Nevertheless, people voted for him. Therefore, that means that there's a large part of the American public who either shares his dislike or disinterest in alliances, or just doesn't care, just doesn't think it's that important. And I think that's, for Europeans, should be a very sobering message. Maybe time for Europeans to begin thinking about other kinds of solutions to defense and security. One of the oddities of the current moment is that I recently looked at some statistics about American support for NATO and American support for alliances, and actually, if you look at opinion polls, it's going up. So as Trump is in office, as people begin to understand what it is that he's doing, the public support is rising, and you hear more about NATO now than you probably did when Obama is president. So that may counteract it. But I think, as I said, a lot depends on what happens next. Is the next American president somebody who's willing to invest in alliances again, to talk about them and to use them, or is this, will it go on reflecting this percentage of the country?
I think this relationship, not just between the US and the UK, but between the US and Europe, is going to face a number of tests.
Yes.
One current test is over Iran and the nuclear deal, where the European nations are absolutely determined to make the arrangements that will enable them to sustain that deal. And that's going to be quite a clash. Secondly, over trade, where in Europe we benefit hugely, not from the law of the jungle operating in international trade, but from the sustaining of a rules-based system. Rules, however, which need to be updated. The rulebook of the WTO, if not antiquated, certainly needs modernizing. On that, Mr. Trump is right, by the way. Trade rules do need to be brought into the 21st century. It's just that his approach to bringing about that change is so counterproductive. Thirdly, the security agenda. I don't simply mean security which in Europe is importantly means on our borders, essentially Russia to our east and the Middle East to our south, but international terrorism and how we collaborate in defeating that, but also the new security agenda of cyber warfare, which is an area where we need intense collaboration and creativity between us. Intense, but which is threatened by the picking apart of the basic relationship between us. But last of all, there's China. China is going to be the big existential question for the world. How we come to terms with the restoration of Chinese economic primacy to its sort of pre-1800 status, whether we are going to embrace China as some sort of friend, ally and collaborator, I think probably not. Are we therefore going to sort of try to contain China? Well, challenging, or are we going to set out on a course of trying to defeat China, which is what President Trump seems to think that we can do? Now, I would say that European policy is somewhere between embracing and containing, and American policy under Mr. Trump is somewhere between containing and defeating. And I think this spells real danger. I'm not anti-Chinese. Please don't get that impression. I just think that this is a stark new reality for the world that has many, many implications. The impact of China's re-rise is going to be felt by us all right across the waterfront, and it would be better if the West were responding and dealing with and thinking through how to deal with China in a unified way. And my great fear at the moment is that won't happen.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great ironies is, of recent politics was the moment when Trump declared this or began this trade war with China, simultaneously beginning a trade war with Europe. The European one didn't go quite as far, but lots of Europeans were saying,
"Wait, it's solved actually."
No, it hasn't. Neither has been solved.
There's a ceasefire, but it's not peace.
No, I know neither is solved. But the point, lots of Europeans were saying, wait a second. We agree that there are problems in trade with China. We agree that our companies are discriminated against there. We're also worried about intellectual property. Why didn't you call us? Why aren't we working together and talking jointly? We're the Europe as a whole, the European Union. Even the EU plus Britain is of, at least in the world of trade, is of equal weight to the United States and China in terms of size and regulatory power and so on. Why didn't you talk to us, and we could have discussed together how we reshape our relationship with China? It was ridiculous for Trump to try and do it without them. Why did he open two fronts at once? Why isn't there a Western joint policy? I mean, that's the way to begin thinking with and dealing with China.
Because he's not a strategist.
No.
He's not a strategist. He is at best a tactician and at worst a populist. He's certainly not a strategist.
Yeah.
We've ranged rather widely. Peter actually even seemed to suggest that there was a robust special relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. I'd now like to come back to the special relationship between the U.S. and Britain, because I think there are a couple testing points coming up. Assuming Brexit goes ahead, the Trade Secretary in Britain, Liam Fox, keeps saying, well, this is going to be wonderful because we'll immediately enter into a great free trade agreement with the United States. That seems to me to be that it could be very much a threshold question about whether or not the special relationship will continue to grow and strengthen. What do you think of the odds of that trade relationship happening? Free trade agreement. Chlorinated chickens.
I mean, we have yes. Does the audience know about chlorinated chicken? This might not be. Yes? No. Okay.
Let's tell them about it.
Okay, so I was once on a panel much like this one in Germany, and the subject was supposed to be threats to the West. And this was actually right after the invasion of Ukraine. So I figured I was invited on this panel to talk about, Putin, and I said something about the military, and we need to be security. And everybody looked at me peculiarly. And then the next person who started talking said, what we really need to fight is chlorinated chicken. And I said, what is, and I had to catch up with this subject. So this is a kind of, Europeans believe that chicken should not be washed in chlorine, and Americans do. And in trade negotiations, and this began when there was a discussion of a transatlantic free trade deal, one of the toughest sticking points was what could American chicken be imported into Europe if it had been washed in chlorine. So it doesn't. I'm tempted to make fun of it, but lots of people take it very seriously, so I probably shouldn't.
Please, this is no joke. I was Europe's trade commissioner for 4.5 years.
Right.
I slept, ate, drank, dreamed chlorinated chicken
Right.
for 4.5 years. You may think it just goes down swimmingly, and it's. I may not think twice, but I tell you, and it was during this time President Bush, George W. Bush, was president, and I, rather unfashionably, but I don't mind admitting, that I must say I developed quite an affection for George W. I mean, I love the way that everyone in Europe poked fun at him and, implied that, he didn't have a brain and he was just a sort of, chap who was shot from the hip and couldn't string 3 words together. Actually, he was a rather more thoughtful person than that, more self-aware.
Well, we now know that it can get a lot worse.
And I was going to say, in comparison to the present, but he was also a rather, I loved his humour. And at the beginning of each trade meeting, and there were quite a few of them between Europe and the United States, either the sort of the summits that we would have every year, or particular trade meetings between us, or meetings that were called together on 2 occasions in the White House to consider the state of the multilateral trade negotiations in the Doha round. But on any bilateral meeting, President Bush, with a wry smile, would strike up and say, well, I think we better get that issue dealt with right at the beginning. And he would turn to his international economic advisor, the head of the international economics in the White House, whose name was Dan, can't remember his second name. And he would turn to Dan and he said, right, chicken wings? Because he always seemed to have a pet name for everyone. He ended up calling me Silver Tongue, because I was always, in my sort of mellifluous English way, telling everyone else how we should conduct these international negotiations.
But it's important. Sorry.
And he'd say, okay, Silver Tongue, what have you got to say for yourself? You've no doubt got a solution. But with this guy Dan, I can't remember his second name. I wish I could. And Dan was terribly serious and intense about chlorinated chicken. He thought this was a real, life or death issue, and that if America didn't prevail on the question of chlorinated, this would be a major existential setback for America's position and role in the world. So chicken wings would always be turned to and asked by President Bush to strike up the usual arguments about European perfidy. And
although this is an issue, I think one of the reasons why it resonated was because there is a fear, this was that among European agricultural producers, and this will be true if Britain is negotiating with the United States too, that our way of doing things is always at threat of being overwhelmed by the size and strength of the United States. And I think one of the issues that's begun to come up in Britain in this, it's still a fairly distant prospect, these real trade negotiations with the United States, is the fear that the U.S. will say, right, if you want to have free trade, you have to accept, chlorinated chicken and,
But
cheap.
Dan, it's even more basic than that. What happened was, do you really want to know the truth about chlorinated chicken? Do you?
That's
yes.
the title of this panel,
I'm going to
by
tell
the way.
you.
Chlorinated
The truth
chicken.
is that the
This
Europeans
is not the first time
spent
this has happened to me.
billions. The Europeans spent a fortune transforming the way in which they took farm animals from, as they called it, from stable to table. And the investment that went in, and the rule making, and the sort of, the laying out of, common law that everyone practiced and behavior that every single farmer in Europe would have to adhere to and respect, was in danger of being severely undercut by cheaper chlorinated chicken from the United States. And so it was a very real economic, very real commercial issue here that, European farmers, people who brought the chickens from the stable to the table, would be undercut by cheaper U.S. produce. And that's why it became so important.
But the other issue at stake, for the British is, negotiating with the European Union, European economy as a whole competes with the U.S. economy in terms of size, in terms of ability, and so on. Britain by itself is much smaller. And so the question for a lot that many are asking is, if and when this negotiation begins, and this I don't know, will the Trump administration, which is famously unfavorable to trade, will it say, okay, we're going to be nice to the British, we won't be too hard on them, we won't demand too much from their manufacturers, or will they go in and say, okay, now you're by yourselves?
No, they're not going to say that. They're going to say, you are going to have the best trade deal that money can buy. And after a very long, painful negotiation, during which Britain will be saying either yes today or yes tomorrow to whatever the US is demanding, we will arrive at a highly political, optical trade agreement, which everyone will celebrate. It will trip up, however, over two major issues. One is agriculture, as we've discussed. The US demand to get US agricultural goods and produce in the British marketplace, and secondly, our desire to have free access to public procurement, to public tendering, not just at federal level, but at state level. I do not believe that President Trump is going to open up the entire, public purchasing system in the United States to Britain, not because Britain will make very much of a dent on it, but the moment it's open to Britain, it will be almost impossible to resist opening it up to Europe and other trading nations with the US. And that's where I believe this great trade agreement is going to founder. It will, however, on the other hand, be a wonderful success. It will just not have a great deal of content.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to predict now, but I mean, you have a number of odd variables. We have the president who's the most unfriendly to trade that we've had in a couple generations, at the same time as we have, and we also remember that we don't know who will be the leader of Britain after Brexit. There's a difference between Theresa May negotiating with Trump and Jeremy Corbyn negotiating with Trump.
What a car crash.
And Jeremy Corbyn may also, I mean, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I suspect he also isn't feel that warm and friendly towards free trade.
What gives you that idea? Yeah, he's a good progressive free market man who
Right, exactly. So
Loves
there are a lot of variables. It also, one of the other possibilities is that, and it's right now is still the most likely possibility, is that Britain leaves the European Union, but in such a way that it remains either within or somehow affiliated to the European Customs Union, in which case there's not going to be a free trade agreement with anybody anyway. And right now, I'd say just guessing percentages, that's still the most likely outcome. So this may all be moot, and we won't have to talk about chlorinated chicken anyway.
Chlorinated coronation chicken.
Chlorinated, yeah.
what a thought. But by the way, what happens if Jeremy Corbyn does become Prime Minister of Britain in the next couple of years?
Well, you could tell me, but I think that the relationship between the United States and Britain would become extraordinarily frayed. I think he's very hostile to Trump. I think Trump would be very hostile to him. I think over Middle East issues, there would be...
Bob, he is not simply anti-Trump.
He's
Don't make that mistake.
You think he's anti-American?
Yeah.
He is rooted in the sort of mindset of the sort of revolutionary socialist student activism that was born of the whole Vietnam struggle in the 1970s. And I tell you, he has not moved on. He's only aged. He hasn't moved on. He is anti-Western because he's anti-American. He's anti-American because he's anti-imperialist. He's anti-imperialist because he's sort of anti-militarist. This is a guy who has a certain set of attitudes. I wouldn't dignify them with the word policy, but attitudes, stances, and positions that will make the conduct of state-level relations between Britain and the United States very challenging indeed.
Even with President Elizabeth Warren.
Yes.
Yeah.
The only disagreement I would have with what you just said is I was anti-Vietnam War because I was pro-American, not because I was anti-American. I thought the Vietnam War was bad for this country.
Yeah.
I think what I see in Corbyn is someone who is a convinced socialist of the old school, represents the kind of people that you and others were pushing out of the Labor Party in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and he now runs the Labor Party. if, as Anne suggests, he takes over and becomes prime minister, I think that would be perhaps the most fraught test of the special relationship since the time before World War II.
And of the transatlantic relationship more generally.
But bear in mind, Jeremy Corbyn also believes that NATO is a militarist concept.
So
He
Putin
thinks that
and
he thinks that first of all he thinks that Putin should that he all he wants to do is to hold out the hand of friendship, and we keep rebuffing him. Secondly, he thinks that NATO's militarism has encroached on Russia's neighborhood and is therefore provocative, that NATO might have been justified during the decades of the Cold War, but is now redundant and should be stood down. I mean, he is not pro-NATO. I'm not saying he's a pacifist, although I think, if he actually had to face engaging in a war, he'd have to be dragged kicking and screaming towards it. But he thinks that the whole concept of NATO is at best redundant and at worst downright provocative and likely to trigger conflict and war, notably with Russia.
well, so he and President Trump might at least agree on being anti-NATO.
Yes, and reaching out to,
Would be a very strange turn.
It would be very odd, but they're two populists. They're like a left and right wing mirror image of each other. They thrive on, generating sort of blame and fear in politics. They thrive on divisions. They're both against elites. They campaign against their own side and want to return power to the people. I mean, the language, the rhetoric that's used by Mr. Trump and Jeremy Corbyn are virtually interchangeable.
And what if...
Now I think about it.
Well, that was the whole purpose of the panel.
Yeah, I mean,
Make you think.
thank you. You've made me think.
And
Isn't that right?
what if instead of a Jeremy Corbyn, you got a Boris Johnson or somebody like that as the British Prime Minister, very conservative Brexiteer? Would that... How is that kind of person
I
going
think
to relate to
disillusionment
President
would
Trump?
set in, but Anne, what do you
Yes,
think?
well, Boris Johnson is an odd, in a way, has some aspirations to be a Trump-like figure in Britain now too.
They both
he
have
did-
very strange hair.
They have strange hair. They have strange hair.
She's sort of propped up by...
Yes.
various-
I mean, Boris has very different origins. I mean, I don't think Boris started out as on the right of the Tory party. In fact, I know he did not start out as a kind of hard right figure. He was originally a journalist, and he started out as somebody who was a very funny writer and parlayed that into politics, and then becoming the mayor of London, a job at which when he held it, he was extremely popular. He's now in an odd position, having backed Brexit, which I'm not sure he ever really believed in, but he's now stuck with it as a career choice. And he continually runs. He's one of these people who's been saying what we really need in Brexit is just to believe in it more. We need more enthusiasm. We need to be more cheerful about it. We need to be more upbeat. And he keeps running into a wall of reality. And I think he is somebody who is in danger of veering off into a kind of not so much conspiracy theories, but populist world where, language doesn't mean anything, and where, if we just all, pull on together and, it will all be fine. He would certainly try to get along with Trump. He would say, he's on the record saying nice things about Trump. He does some Trump-like, uses some Trump-like tactics. He's a little bit of an imitator. But I agree with Peter that almost immediately, things would founder on the rock of reality, as they have for Boris so far. And we've already discussed what issues would come up in trade agreements. There would be immediate differences on all kinds of issues, around the world as well.
They're going to cut us off in 30 seconds. I want to thank Anne and Peter for a panel that I think was not only enlightening, but enjoyable. Thanks very much.
Thanks.